Welcome to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, hosted by Dr. Katharine Stevens. Early Matters features in-depth conversations with leading researchers, practitioners, and policy experts on what matters most for young children and their families to thrive.
Welcome to Early Matters. I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, Joe Waters, who's the co-founder and CEO of Capita, launched in 2018. Capita is a think tank dedicated to exploring how the cultural and social transformations of our day affect young children and their families, and to fostering new ideas and policies to build a future in which all children and families flourish. In particular, Capita has emphasized improving the lives of our youngest children, boosting social connection, and helping parents feel less alone. I'm excited to hear more about their work. Joe, welcome to Early Matters.
Thank you, Katharine. Really appreciate it.
To start with, can you talk about why and how you started Capita, I guess about 5 years ago? Where did the idea for Capita come from?
Yeah, the idea for Capita had actually been nurtured, I think, over the course of several years. I had begun working in early childhood policy. I think it was in the spring of 2011. And that was mostly based in South Carolina. But we also had a federal social innovation fund grant in the Obama administration to support jurisdictions around the country in scaling up evidence-based early childhood interventions, primarily home visiting, actually. And in the course of that work, I was coming into contact with sort of broader ideas around social innovation and impact investing. And what just really crystallized for me was that there were not organizations out there looking at how what was going on in the culture and society, and frankly, ecologically more broadly, was impacting children, families, and their communities. There was a lot of focus on programs. Let's get more money to invest in this particular program, which will solve this particular problem. And, not a lot of energy around how the deterioration of neighborhoods or the opioid epidemic or climate disruption were going to drive poorer or better, depending on what sort of transformation you're talking about, outcomes for children over the course of this century. And so we founded Capita to really be a think tank that would take seriously the science of early development, but would be looking very intentionally and closely at how those broader transformations in culture and society were impacting children and families, and then proposing public policies to support the flourishing of children and families in those contexts.
So when you say we, if I remember correctly, you actually founded Capita with two very old friends from college. Is that right? Can you say a little bit more about them and how you guys are working together? That's
right. Yeah. So this is in some ways a very unique and interesting story. It's also a great joy to have found something with longtime friends. So Grady Powell and Brandon Hinman are my co-founders. I met Grady Powell my very first day of college. When I was moving in, he lived across the hall. I met Brandon shortly thereafter. We have been engaged in building things now for over 20 years. Grady runs a wonderful consulting firm based in Greenville, South Carolina, which is my hometown, called Open Fields. And when I was at the Institute for Child Success, where I worked before founding Capita, we had hired Open Fields on several projects. And I really enjoyed working with Grady now in our adult careers. And so we had obviously been talking about leadership and strategic foresight, how all of these ideas around social innovation and impact investing and so forth that we were working with impact children and families and could be leveraged to improve outcomes for children and families. And so we got together and we founded Capita together.
And who is the other person?
Brandon Hinman.
Is he full-time with you guys, or is he also engaged in other things?
Neither of them are full-time with Capita. Grady is the CEO of Open Fields, And Brandon works for a company based in Atlanta called Switch Yards, which is a neighborhood work club. And they've now opened over a dozen neighborhood work clubs in Atlanta and just recently in Nashville. They're these beautifully designed spaces for people to work, to have a cup of coffee, to meet up, right, with others in their community. And so, Brandon is very much an artist, a designer, a creative, and he brings that to his professional work. He also brings that perspective very much to what he does with Capita as a volunteer.
So what kinds of, sort of more specifically speaking, what kinds of work is Capita doing? And I know you work globally. I'm interested in that in general, but as you know, my focus is the United States. So I'm especially interested in hearing about US focused work, but anything that you think is worth highlighting.
So we work in three primary programmatic areas. The first is putting young children at the center of climate change policy. The second is building a culture of solidarity and care. And the third is around childcare. But specifically, what we've done in our work around childcare is to explore pathways to a more just and humane childcare economy, particularly for the people who work in that sector. And that has really taken the form, for example, of exploring the possibility of more worker ownership of childcare businesses, helping the people who make those businesses valuable own those businesses.
So what kind of ties those things together? How would you articulate the kind of the heart, the core aim of these strands of work?
They are barriers to human flourishing in this day and age. Each of those, climate change, ecological destruction, the displacement that is likely to come from it is a barrier to human flourishing, and so forth with solidarity and care. Social disconnection and loneliness is a barrier to human flourishing that is particularly bad for families with young children. And we can say the same with the childcare economy.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by human flourishing? What does that term encompass?
Yeah, I think for me and for most of our work, we talk about human flourishing in terms of setting the conditions for people to become who they want to be with passion, with purpose, and with excellence. And, we know the science of early childhood development is clear that the foundations for flourishing are established in those very earliest years of life.
You wrote a really interesting piece a few years ago that I came across recently, arguing that in the US, our thinking and action in early childhood is hampered, or I think you even said crippled, by what you described as a program first approach. As I understand it, a program first approach means kind of a primary focus on government programs in early childhood, for example, like childcare, pre-K, Head Start, rather than what you described as a more interdisciplinary, more inclusive approach that aims to address children's broader developmental, emotional, educational needs. And you argued would also help us do a better job of ensuring that limited public resources are being used in the most effective and efficient ways possible. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I'd just love to hear more about your thinking on that.
Well, first of all, the insight is not mine. The insight was Daniel Patrick Moynihan's in a wonderful essay he wrote on programs versus policy in the 1970s. So right at the end of the 1960s, the Great Society, the war on poverty, and really sort of trying to account for the situation in terms, particularly in American cities, which was a real concern of his. And so my argument, my suggestion here is that when we talk about policy affecting young children or early childhood policy, we tend to mean only the funding of programs that are sort of directly in this space we might call early childhood or early care and education. So think, for example, about childcare, about home visiting, and so forth. it's necessary to fund many of those things. And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't. What I'm arguing instead is that we need to zoom out a bit further and taking into account the science of human development and the responsibility of government. What we need to do is to create a whole of government policy that takes that science into account, that takes what we know about child development and human flourishing into account. So here, what do I mean? We know, for example, that poverty is very, very bad for children's healthy development. That should not just be, addressing that should not just be the responsibility of one agency within one department of the federal government that is responsible for child care vouchers, for example. It needs to be a whole of government approach. We have examples of this: employment policy, monetary policy, defense policy, foreign policy. The national security of the United States is not just the responsibility of the Department of State or the Department of Defense. Frankly, it's a responsibility that's spread across government.
Kind of goal-driven.
That's right. We need something similar for young children and their families. And we have a model for this in the Employment Act of 1946, where Congress established a goal of full employment as the policy of the United States and instructed the executive branch and various entities within the executive branch to not only work to achieve that, but to then report on it, and to report on it in a comprehensive whole of government way. My vision would be that we have something similar, and I've actually drafted what a statement of policy might look like that Congress could pass, establishing a goal of the federal government, maximizing the flourishing and well-being of all young children and their families.
So, as you well know, the way government works, in theory anyway, is kind of operating against specific kind of measurable outcomes, right? And so, for example, the Employment Act of 1946, whether people are employed or not employed, is very measurable, right? It's pretty unidimensional, pretty straightforward. So what you're saying makes perfect sense. And it just seems as though that would just be a much better way of approaching advancing the well-being of children and families. If there's an across-government kind of mandate to maximize the flourishing of children and families, that won't work in government unless there are specific metrics that they can measure, right? And I think that's one of the reasons, for example, there's this focus on childcare, right? Kids are either in childcare or they're not. They get subsidies or they don't, right? Which is a much, much narrower agenda than what you're talking about, which is maximizing the flourishing of young children and families. What are the kinds, do you have any thoughts on what the kinds of things are that we could be looking at to know whether or not we succeeded in that goal in maximizing flourishing for those populations?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we obviously have to establish metrics, and there's research emerging on human flourishing, which I'd very much like to see brought into this conversation so that we aren't just measuring sort of what we typically measure when it comes to early childhood programs and young children. But for example, I sometimes say, let's take the Department of Labor, for example. What is the Department of Labor's responsibility as it relates to employment? They publish employment statistics every month. Are there ways, for example, that we can measure employment of parents with young children? Are there ways to measure wages of parents with young children? Of course, there are. We just need to report on them as such, right? So in some ways, I don't think it's so much about coming up with new metrics as it is presenting metrics, presenting data in ways that indicates the responsibility that we should set in the policy at the federal level.
Wages is obviously key. Employment in some cases could be a good thing, or depending on how a parent is wanting their child cared for, not a good thing. I'm just trying to think of what are some other kinds of things that we could be looking at that would give us a better picture of whether or not young children are and their families are flourishing. And I'm thinking of is it called the Global Happiness Index?
Yeah, the Global Happiness Index, I think certainly that those sorts of metrics are maybe the kinds of things that we could be looking at. I think social capital and social connection. We're, for example, very concerned about parental loneliness. The indications are strong that parents are lonely. The Surgeon General has raised awareness about this issue, which is very important, of loneliness as a public health issue. What do we know about loneliness? What do we think we know about loneliness? Lonely people have diminished capability, the research would suggest, have diminished capability to do the types of things that we know are good for parent-child bonding, holding attention, self-regulation, and so forth, right? And so, Senator Murphy, for example, from Connecticut, this summer introduced a piece of legislation to establish a national social connections strategy, an Office of Social Connection in the White House. Measuring parent social connection would be the type of thing that I would imagine we would want to measure to support, to embrace this government-wide policy approach to meeting the needs of young children. I sometimes say, Katharine, that the way we treat programs in early childhood, as important as those are, is as if we were the Department of Defense offering the F-35, a single fighter jet program, as the sum total of our national security strategy, right? And so we have to be much more imaginative about what leveraging the powers of government must look like to promote the holistic development and flourishing of young children. And it doesn't happen through even a dozen programs, but through all entities taking responsibility for maximizing the flourishing and well-being of our children.
And it sounds like you're saying using that lens to see their work.
That's right.
Kind of switching to a sort of extreme example of a program first approach, which, as you know, I've been very concerned about, is this dominant narrative that's been gaining a great deal of momentum in early childhood. It seems to me that it's kind of dominating advocacy and thinking about early childhood around what's now being described as the, quote, childcare crisis. And the core idea that's being very vigorously promoted, coming from a number of different sectors and groups, the idea is that we urgently have to fund government-supported childcare for every child, now starting at birth, because a lack of childcare means that women are forced to leave the workforce, which hurts their careers, which hurts economic productivity. And more recently, I've observed that there's an additional argument that's been added on, which is that beyond the needs of the economy, beyond the needs of women, both of which obviously are very important, that childcare is actually good for children, kind of an affirmative good, with a growing implication that it's healthier for them to be in childcare rather than at home with their parents. What are your thoughts on that?
I always want to take a step back and come back again to the lens and language of human flourishing. What can we do to maximize the well-being and the flourishing of every child and every family? And my view on that is to maximize their choices, maximize the potential for a family to make the sorts of childcare decisions that they feel are best for them and for their children, with as much information and awareness of what those options are that we can possibly give them. So for me, my perspective is always going to be, what can we do to maximize choice? And I do become frustrated with this conversation in several ways, but one way is that, well, let me put it this way. Most people that I encounter in my personal life who have young children are dissatisfied in one way or another with their childcare arrangements. They're not happy about them. They get stressed out about them, either because it's unpredictable or maybe because they just don't have the choices that they feel like they want to have, right? And so I want to create conditions where people have choice and where that choice is empowered.
To me, that is exactly the right way to think about this. And my concern is that this really overwhelming, almost at times feeling like an onslaught of promoting what is now increasingly called education starting at birth for all children, which is as you know, the language used, that narrative is kind of sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And that in practice, at the same time, there's as you know, a small emerging focus on promoting parental care, which a substantial proportion of parents in this country would prefer. They just can't afford it, right?
Right. And that, I think, is the nub of the issue. They cannot afford it, right? Because we have an economy that is frankly so barbaric in its treatment of families that it will not let parents be parents in the ways that they want to be, right? Either because they are middle or upper income and they are on the treadmill of workism, or because they are lower income and they have to work 3 jobs with unpredictable scheduling. And so, so much of our childcare discussion, I think, does not take into account the economic reality that we have to address, because this economy does not work for children, families, and communities.
Right. That's right. So what I worry about is that the narrative, the current sort of dominant narrative, actually doesn't say that, right? And when I have had this conversation with people to say there is a great deal of evidence that in many cases, the optimal early learning environment for young children is their own home. And that is what actually many parents, particularly lower and working and middle class parents, prefer. That the argument that I get is that's not how our economy is. That's unrealistic. The business community plays a powerful role and they need a high quality workforce. They're concerned about maximizing workforce participation. And as a result, the best solution is for us to fund what is described as, quote, high quality group non-parental care for all young children starting at birth. What are your thoughts on that? In the sense that, is that advocacy push, is that narrative compatible with a narrative of, as you said, taking a step back and figuring out what is truly best for children and how can we maximize, as you said, parent choice? Just starting from a clean slate in the conversation. What do you think about that?
Well, I would prefer, first of all, that we start not from the place of how can we maximize outcomes for businesses and for the economy, but how can we maximize for the human flourishing of persons and families, right? And the way that the dialogue, the way that the argument starts now assumes that the person exists for the economy, not that the economy exists for the human person. And so I am unwilling to just surrender on this point that we can't make the economy better for children, families, and communities. And so we just need to provide childcare options that support parents being more successful in this economy. I think we can make the economy more humane for children, families, and communities, and we shouldn't just surrender that argument. I think our childcare policy, whatever it is as a country, needs to start from what I think the truth of the matter is, that the economy exists for the person. And it's obviously necessary for creating the material conditions for human flourishing, but the economy exists for the person, not the other way around. And I think if we could all get on board with that as a first principle, we might be able to generate not only a more humane economy, but a more humane childcare policy that supports children and supports parents in being the kind of parents that they want to be, that supports flourishing for them and for their kids.
So I've just been getting increasingly pessimistic about being able to move in the direction you've just described because of the vigorous pushing of this really dominant narrative that is just throughout the media now, right? I mean, there's headlines all over the place. The childcare crisis has to be solved to the tune of billions and billions of federal dollars for all children starting at birth, because we have to maximize labor productivity, we have to raise GDP, and we're marinating in that message. And if we could just stop that and start with the message that you were describing, right, where all those same people just started to say, we need to prioritize the well-being of children and families. What is the policy conversation we need to be having to center our thinking, our spending? That, in my mind, would be preferable. And I just worry that the train has left the station, maybe like an hour ago. What do you think?
You're right. And I think we sometimes feel a great deal of inertia, right? In terms of the policy conversation is moving in one direction, and it's very difficult to pull it back. What we have sort of done at Capita is say, well, we're not going to try and pull the conversation back. We're going to create an alternate space for the generation of new ideas, right? And to nurture those ideas. And frankly, we do this in part by being outside the Beltway and being intentionally outside the Beltway. We're not tempted to get caught up in the immediate churn of, what's happening on Capitol Hill every day. There are people who do that. There are people who need to do that. But we also need alternate spaces for the generation of new, creative policy proposals that are not beholden to the politics of the moment.
Right, exactly. So what are the kinds of things that Capita is working on that you're most excited about in that respect, currently or coming down the pike?
Well, we're going to shift, and it's a little early because we're still iterating around it, but we're going to shift our approach to childcare from a pretty narrow focus on building a more just and humane childcare economy to a broader focus on generating new, fresh policy proposals that leverage our long-term interest in the tools of strategic foresight and futures thinking to begin to imagine and to create the childcare policy for 2050, the childcare policy for 2075, right? That takes into account big trends in culture and society, right? Going back to your initial introduction of Capita, big trends in culture and society, like declining fertility rates, like changing nature of work, like the growing disparity in educational attainment between men and women. We're not aware of a conversation about new, fresh childcare policy that takes all of that into account, that has really gotten critical energy behind it yet, right? And we want to push more in those directions.
If you had to focus on just one or two things, what do you see as the most critical priorities for advancing the well-being of infants and toddlers in the U.S.? What's most urgent, and where can the biggest gains be made, do you think?
Well, I would make, I think, this point I think the most important thing in some ways that any of us can be working on, in addition to adapting to the climate crisis and everything else, the climate disruption, is to rebuild a more humane economy. And how we do that is going to happen in various ways. So much of what I see that is hurting children and families stems from a neoliberal economy, which frankly, I think the engine of that is sputtering. And we need to build a more solidaristic economy. This is what American Compass is doing. This is what people like Chris Murphy are saying in the Senate we must do. And I think that we all need to put much more energy behind that effort with a focus on the flourishing and the well-being of children and families. And that's going to mean very concrete proposals, of course, like parental leave. I'm sorry, it is barbaric that we would ever ask a mother to leave a 2, 3, 4-week-old to go back to work. Mother or father, frankly. I mean, I took a month off when my son was born. It's critically important. This economy does not allow that. And so there obviously is a place for concrete policy proposals, but more broadly, we need to build a more solidaristic economy that puts the human person at the center.
So to totally switch gears, what brought you to this work? What in your childhood, your education, your personality, do you think has led you to this work and this way of thinking about your work?
The most concise answer is that I had the benefit of being deeply formed in Catholic social teaching. And so what does Catholic social teaching say? I grew up Catholic. My parents, very devout. We were weekly Mass-going Catholics. I was very interested in it, continued to be so through college, did a master's degree in divinity at Duke University, which was actually, despite being a Methodist seminary, it's a great place it was, at least at that time, a great place to study Catholic social teaching, because you had theologians like Stanley Hauerwas and Jeffrey Wainwright who were very familiar with Catholic social teaching and who were bringing Catholic social teaching and virtue ethics into conversation with American Protestantism. So it was a great place to study that and to be a Catholic at that time. I assume it is now, but as I get further and further away, those professors that were so formative for me are retiring or have retired. So at any rate, it's Catholic social teaching is the core formative reality in my life on these issues. What does Catholic social teaching prioritize? It prioritizes the dignity of the human person. It prioritizes our interdependence and solidarity. It prioritizes subsidiarity, solving problems closest to the problem. It prioritizes responsibility for and care of creation. And it does so since the Second Vatican Council in a way that I think is increasingly intelligible and resonant with people who are not religiously practicing Catholics. So those formative experiences in my childhood, straight through college and graduate school, and of course my continuing interest in these topics, the Catholic social teaching, probably are the deepest source, the deepest well of my commitments and why I came to this work on behalf of children and families. I also ran for public office when I was in my mid-20s in South Carolina and for the State House of Representatives in South Carolina. And I ran in part because I felt very convicted, so to speak, about many of the problems that South Carolina faces and that stem from historic, systematic, structural injustice and racism that has resulted in a persistent poverty problem in many parts of South Carolina. And so just digging in as a candidate for public office, of course I lost, but digging in as a candidate for public office on what works led me to see very clearly that investment in those earliest years of life, supporting families when their children are youngest, is the best thing that we can do to build flourishing over the life course.
Well, Joe, thank you very much for spending this time with us. I am looking forward to following your work and hopefully collaborating if we can find an opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Katharine. It's great to be with you.
Thanks so much to Joe for taking the time for this wonderful conversation, and thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Check out our work at ccfp.org and follow us on Twitter at _CCFP and at KB Stevens. We'll see you on the next episode of Early Matters.
You've been listening to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, produced by the Center on Child and Family Policy.